Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Jams and Tea content. Not a podcast, though, because today we're coming at you with something a little bit different. We're coming at you with a video talking about Ryley and I's some of our favorite guitar solos. The art of the guitar solo is one that is widely recognized and appreciated by all music lovers, but we wanted to do something a little bit more specific too, is that when it comes to the conversation of great guitar solos, the great guitar solos canon is already littered with a litany of outstanding, widely recognized, widely beloved picks that we kind of didn't want to pick because they're a bit too on the nose. You know, the Eddie Vedders of the world and the David Gilmour solos, they get so much love as it is. We kind of wanted to maybe sidestep it and be a little bit more adventurous with some of our picks.
And also the thing is, like, you've probably already heard all the canonical picks. So the point of this video is to highlight solos that we love, also to talk a little bit about what the solo is and like why I guess people have like an attachment to guitar solos. Like, what is it about the guitar solo that people find so endearing, and also just give you some recommendations for solos that we love that you might not have heard or thought about or considered. Some of them from very famous guitarists that you will be familiar with, but in some instances I think we're going to highlight maybe some of their lesser known solos that we have a particular affinity for. So
I think we wanted to walk the line between things that are like widely recognized and appreciated, but also things that are just a little bit more left of the dial.
Yeah, absolutely. So what Jake and I have done is that we've come up with individual lists of our 5 picks for solos for this video. We also have honorable mentions to shout out as well. And what we'll do is we'll go over our honorable mentions and then we will count down our individual top 5s alternating until we get to our number 1 favorite guitar solo. So, or most underappreciated guitar solo in our opinions.
And in the description of this video, we're going to set up a straw poll to what do you, of the solos that we talk about in our top 5s, which is your favorite? Talk about it, listen to it. We want to know.
Yeah,
feedback
exactly.
from you.
Exactly. So vote in that poll if you're interested, and also let us know in the comments as well what your favorite solos are, what you think are some of the most underappreciated solos. And obviously the guitar solo is not the only example of like a virtuosic individual performance shining through in a group setting. Like, we may talk about other instrumental solos in the future. I think a drum solo video could be really cool. But even before we get into our list, just kind of as a little bit of an impromptu, like, what is it about the guitar solo, Jake, that you think like means so much to people?
I think that really it's the most immediate, isolated element of musical construction that leaps out at people, because like as long as I have been aware of music, I have been aware of guitars and guitar solos. So I feel like it's the first thing that really leaps out at you as being something that's really virtuosic and impressive, and something that like one of the ways people are first captivated by music in a way that is simultaneously incredibly skillful on behalf of the musician's part, but also really easy to recognize by people who are not necessarily well versed in the world of music.
And I would also say as well, like, it seems to me one of the most kind of obvious ways that rock and roll, when it sort of first came about in the 50s and 60s, took from jazz music too. Because when you think about jazz music, you think about the idea of a band of players kind of playing off of each other, but also having individual spotlights for solo moments that are a kind of foundational traditional aspect of jazz performances, is the solo, alternating between.
And in that respect, I feel like we could do our own video on jazz guitar solos. I mean, like, that's a whole world in and of itself.
I mean, spoiler alert, I do have one on my list. But yes, it is its own sort of thing. And so rock and roll, which is very much a form that is super, super different to jazz in a lot of ways, borrowed elements from jazz in terms of that communal performance aspect and in terms of the showcases of individual virtuosity. And I think that as much as people have always loved bands, I think there's something about seeing a group of musicians who are super, super tightly knit together, but then also getting a chance to see them shine individually in a way that I think is a big part of how people connect with rock musicians and rock bands, is that seeing that moment in the spotlight and being able to appreciate that virtuosic talent when it's really kind of foregrounded. So yeah, I think that's why, one of the reasons, maybe you might have some more theories at home as to why guitar solos are such a kind of cultural icon of rock music. So before we get into our actual lists, let's do some honorable mentions. But with that, let's get into the actual countdown of our 10 guitar solos, 5 each. Let's start with our respective number 5s. Jake, why don't you kick us off?
All right, well, I'm going to start my list proper with being stereotypically me. And I had to, of course, pick something on a Porcupine Tree song. And let me tell you, I was not starved for options, and I wasn't starved for guitarist either. I could have picked something off of Deadwing. I could have gone with the solos by Michael Ackerfeld or Adrian Belew, or I could have gone with Alex Lifeson on Fear of a Blank Planet. And Steven Wilson himself, who I ended up choosing as my guitarist of choice here, because I kind of think that in the world of prog and rock music, Steven Wilson is a bit of an underrated guitarist, or at least doesn't really get his due for how proficient he is. And the solo of his that I have picked is I think the thing that makes this solo notable is really that how it all goes down back to song construction and overall context, because solos by definition are sort of like a singular, isolated movement of one instrument, but that doesn't always mean it's the only component to it. I feel like knowing when structurally to put in a solo, and especially just, what that ends up entailing. Of course, this is one of the most rip-roaring solos the man has ever composed. It's an absolutely squalling, distorted, basically the exact thing you want when you want a really grungy, very just kind of tortured solo that comes off of this song that's full of this simmering kind of disdain, and it all builds and builds and builds to that very end and that final sort of third where this solo really kicks into gear and starts off by really interpolating that melody that's at the beginning of the song. And as it kind of goes, you're almost lost for a moment and whoa, he gets really, really fucking distinct with his finger picking later into this. And then it sort of is woven back into the song, which is a really common feature with my top 5 here, is that I love it when it sort of takes on its own identity as a solo and then is woven back into the song later. And this is a fucking perfect example of that. It adds a real dynamism to the already core track, fuses it together at the end. It's one of the best meat and potatoes solos on here, one of the most traditionally recognizable. And in my opinion, on Lightbulb Sun, it's one of the most quintessentially Steven Wilson-ish moments, and an album full of moments where you can feel the influence of David Gilmour on something like Russia on Ice, or just the influence of tons of other musicians that Steven had been homaging his entire career. This is one of the few moments that really does feel like it is a Steven Wilson guitar solo.
Right, my number 5 pick, and again, was really brutal trying to decide what to leave off and leave on, but I want to shout out one of my a solo that I've loved for a really long time, because this was a band that I got really, really into as a teenager, and I've always appreciated how utterly deranged this solo is. That's a characteristic, I think, of a lot of what I love about individual solo moments in rock material, is when guitarists take the opportunity to do something really unconventional. And so my number 5 pick is Let's Call It Love, is kind of the climax of the 2005 Sleater-Kinney record, The Woods. It's an 11-minute song, and roughly half of that runtime is dominated by this solo from Carrie, although she is going absolutely hog wild during the other half as well, where it's the kind of conventional part of the song. But once the song part kind of stops about 5 minutes in, and Carrie just kind of takes over with this really squalling guitar solo, which is produced to have such heft and loudness by Dave Fredman. and it just absolutely goes all over the shop. And there's a lot of influence, I think, from the guitar work of Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin on this particular record. It's got that real sort of classic rock feel, but Carrie takes it in this particularly kind of squalling direction with this track that I absolutely love. And it helps that she is sort of backed by the incredible drumming of Janet Weiss as well, who eventually is kind of so overpowered by Carrie's playing that it just kind of starts to dominate the song. But yeah, I've always loved, it's always been my favorite Sleater-Kinney record. It's always been one of my favorite Sleater-Kinney moments. And it feels very much like a real flex. And I don't honestly think that really most of my picks have that kind of flex feel to them in the way that this does. But it's one of those moments where you have been taken on such a ride up to this point that the flex feels earned and kind of triumphant, especially considering that Sleater-Kinney would kind of go on hiatus after this. So in a lot of ways, this solo itself not only represents a great moment within a record and a great moment for a guitarist like Carrie, but also kind of like the climax of the Sleater-Kinney arc up to that point. So yeah, love that solo. That's my number 5 pick.
Totally agree with you. Fucking great moment. And I'm also just glad that we shout out a badass female guitarist on this list at some point.
Absolutely.
And, you know, on the note of something being like really indulgent and impressive, I feel like the theme with my list is that I kind of wanted to start off with stuff like that and then work my way into the weirder, more unconventional picks. So number 4 moment on my list here is Jerry Cantrell's solo off of Deftones' Phantom Bride. Famous moment on this channel when we talked about Phantom Bride of Morgan figuring out for the first time that solo was in fact done by Jerry Cantrell of Alice in Chains.
I'm sorry. What?
Did you not know?
No.
That's, yeah.
You're kidding me.
Yeah, it's listed on the Apple Music feature for
It is not on Spotify.
Jerry Cantrell plays the guitar solo in Phantom Bride.
He absolutely does.
Oh my god.
Basically, his reaction to that moment is like my reaction to when I first heard this solo. This is just kind of something that, like, on a record like Gore that has many problems, including that of, you know, just the production overall, this is one where all of them just kind of fade to the periphery and you don't care. The atmosphere and general tone of this song is a very, like, mournful, you know, the atmospheric tone of everything that was happening on Gore and on this sort of phase in Deftones' career post Koino Yokon. And this part here is just like, it's really, you know, it's conventional Deftones. It's what you want out of a song like this. And I think the cool thing about this is the first solo I talked about, Steven Wilson's, is I love that one for how synergistic that is within its own song. Whereas I love this one because of contrast. The second you fucking hear this guitar, if you don't immediately know it's Jerry Cantrell, you know that it's somebody who wants to play like Jerry Cantrell. This kind of bluesy guitar tone is just nowhere near anything on the Deftones catalog. It doesn't sound like anything on any of their other songs. So you are immediately struck by it.
It doesn't remotely sound like the playing of Stephen Carpenter. And one of the funny sort of things about it is that, like, famously, when they were recording that album, like, Stephen Carpenter was kind of like mentally absent and wasn't really committing himself all that much. And that was one of the reasons why the album recording process was so fraught. And so when you're listening to this album that just is a good record, but it has like so much of the lifeblood of Deftones kind of absent and sucked out of it, when you get to this song, which is beautifully placed as the penultimate track, you suddenly have these fucking, the iconic sound of Cantrell. And I want to commend you as well for picking a Cantrell solo that's not on an Alice in Chains song, because there's a lot of those to pick
that
from.
was kind of like my instinct, but I was just like, in my heart of hearts, I feel like with Alice in Chains, that's the thing, is that he melds in together with that sound so well. But when it comes to the idea of the guitar solo, when it comes to standing out, this is one of the best of all time, in my opinion. Whether or not we're picking something left of the dial, this would easily make the top echelon of my list, is that this is the art of the guitar solo, because it knows how to not go against the song, but to complement the song while still being its own kind of art form. And even still, it is still incorporated into the track beyond just the solo. It kind of interweaves with the other guitar playing for that final minute of the song, which is just sublime. Like, oh my God, like She's Moved On does a great job at this, but I actually feel like this is one of the few moments where the sort of strangled production of Gore actually complements this element, because the way that this sounds in tandem with the other, it's mind-blowing. And also, I mean, just like even before that, it's just it's a chilling solo. Like, this is a song that's about someone who is, emotionally isolating themselves to protect themselves from the fear of being hurt. So this coming out, it's like it's grabbing you and pulling you out of that place and forcing you to feel it. It's awesome.
Yeah. My number 4 is something a little bit more obscure that I had a chance to shout out in a semi-recent record club of mine. This is like one of those amazing fucking moments where my jaw just drops, and not only in just like awe of what I'm hearing, but just of how like it just comes out of nowhere. Again, kind of like that Deftones pick in its own way, where it's like you have this kind of moodier track, and this record as well, Leaving Your Body Map up to this point has been quite moody. And then you just, the first half of this is sort of like really atmospheric and moody and kind of beautiful and dreamy. And then there's just a point about 6.5 minutes in where all of that kind of comes to a thudding stop, and suddenly you get this rip-roaring solo that lasts for about a minute. And it's just like, it's straight out of the classic rock playbook in a lot of ways. It feels very like 70s and its aesthetic and its feel, even though this record was of course released in 2000 or 2001. And it just has this sense of immediate timelessness to it. And it's so virtuosic without being like overly showy. It just has this sense of immaculate tastefulness to it, while of course, because it's a Maudlin of the Well record, it has a sense of complexity to the dynamic and harmonic arrangement and the choices and the chords and all that sort of thing. It goes all over the shop, but at no point does it do anything less than just put a big fat smile on your face, because it's such a baller ass solo. So this is probably the most obscure one on my list, but even if you don't have the time to listen to the full sort of Maudlin of the Well double album, at least go and check out this solo, at least check out this song, and if it doesn't make you want to listen to more of these amazing musicians, then nothing will, because it's just one of those moments where you're like, fucking dude, how did you do that? I love it.
Couldn't agree more. Fantastic moment on a fantastic record. And now we're in the top 3. And my pick that just missed the top 2 is, I'm trying to be a little bit more unconventional with my picks here, something that I feel goes a little bit beyond and kind of bends the idea of what a guitar solo can even be and kind of challenges the notion a little bit. And my pick for number 3 is from an artist who has worked with no shortage of fantastic guitarists, including ones we've already mentioned, that being David Bowie. But it's not David Bowie on the guitar. I'm talking about... There's actually a bit of a story behind this, is that when they were making the album in the studio, eventually, like, Gabriel's like, there wasn't a solo planned on this song. And at some point, Bowie was just like, I think this deserves a guitar solo. I want you to do one. And he was like, okay. But Bowie gave him some constrictions and said, I think we should have a guitar solo on that song. I said, really? And he said, yes, but on that first chord, you can only use your low E string. The second chord, you can only use your low A string. The third chord, only the D string, and the fourth chord, only the G string. And you've got to play constant 16th notes. And he said, if I didn't have some level of chops, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And he went on to say about it that by putting into this box stylistically, you become defined by your limitations. The arbitrary limitation of that approach made me do stuff that I normally wouldn't have done. It's actually one of my favorite guitar solos I've recorded. The overall arc of it has this nice sex-like orgasmic form. It has a nice starting point, a plateau stage, a peak, and a climax and a resolution. In a way, it's a statement of dick control. And honestly, I really couldn't have said it better myself. Like, Looking for Satellites is one of my favorite songs off of what I consider to be one of the best Bowie albums. And it's just because this album and this song is just so bug nutty. And then the final 2 minutes of this are just kind of dominated. This is probably the longest solo on my list. And it just keeps going. And the way that, like, the limitation thing was interesting to learn, because the versatility and how this actually ends up sounding in the final product is fucking crazy. The way this ends up sounding, I mean, honestly, you could probably guess that it's a couple other instruments other than a guitar after the first, like, couple of bars. Like, I think this is an entire 16-bar long solo, which is fucking nuts, by the way. But it also sounds like an alarm call at some point. It just sounds like various, like, pieces of technology, which is totally what Bowie was trying to evoke on this song and on this album, as this song is sort of a moment of talking about the sort of moment in the 90s of where technology was coming over to, you know, rule over their lives in a kind of omniscient way. And Bowie was always fascinated by that. So the way it sort of blends with the theme of the song, while still remaining as like a highlight, like a recognizable point of obvious virtuosity, is really what gets me here. But there is not a guitar solo I have ever heard that sounds quite this fucking weird. And that's honestly why it's here, is because it's still recognizably of the form, but it's also something that departs from it in a way that only quintessentially I feel like would be on a David Bowie album.
My number 3 pick. Okay, and this is a point where even though we're kind of looking at rock solos, I want to shout out a jazz guitar solo from probably, maybe not, I don't know if he's the most famous, but certainly one of the most virtuosic jazz fusion guitarists. Of course, the legendary John McLaughlin. And I knew as soon as we came up with this idea, I knew I wanted to put a McLaughlin solo on this list, because he's just, to me, like, definitely, I guess if you're a fusion head, you probably talk about McLaughlin all the time, but generally speaking, I don't see him come up in conversations of great guitarists, because the world of jazz fusion gets overlooked a lot, obviously. And because we were trying to spotlight sort of slightly more obscure picks as well, that kind of got me thinking about, okay, so I could easily pick anything on Intermounting Flame, or I could pick anything on one of his sort of collaborations with Miles Davis, or anything in that direction. But I decided to go with a song, with a solo. Well, it's kind of hard to just say a solo, because it's like the entire song is the solo. But it's from the collaborative record that he did with Carlos Santana called Love Devotion.
Another one of the best.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, you heard right. If you didn't already know that, Carlos Santana and John McLaughlin made a record together in the early 70s. There's a couple of Coltrane covers on there, but the real standouts are the originals, pieces that Santana and McLaughlin composed on the fly. And I was having a tough time deciding between the two kind of gigantic mammoth pieces here, but in the end I went with The Life Divine, which is like an incredible 9-minute showcase for how virtuosic McLaughlin is. And the other big long track on this record, which is the 15-minute Let Us Go Into the House of the Lord, is also fantastic and insane and crazy. But to me, like, that's almost like what's so powerful about is the sense of kind of lost control from Santana and McLaughlin. Whereas what I like about The Life Divine is there's this sense of tightness and real precision in McLaughlin's playing that he purposefully designs to be just dizzying and sort of, you know, scattershot. Like the stuff that he's doing musically, I don't even have the musical knowledge to fully understand every decision that he's making here, but it's always something that makes you go, what, how, what? And it's not about
that's like, the appeal of jazz fusion guitarists, is that you could be the most storied musical critic in the world and you would just be like, I don't fucking know how he did that.
And it's not about like, you know, just constantly being slapped in the face necessarily. Like one of the things that makes it so powerful, and McLaughlin is great at doing this, is he can sustain a guitar solo for that length of time, but he can include these sort of ebbs and flows within it. such that there are individual moments in the guitar soloing that really leap out, but they're made doubly impactful by the more sort of smooth and subtle playing of the parts that sort of lead into or come before and after those kind of big moments. And so Life Divine is full of those, I think. It's a gorgeous piece of guitar work and also an opportunity for me to shout out Love, Devotion, Surrender, which is a great record that any fan of fusion or rock music should check out. I mean, any excuse to listen to McLaughlin and Santana on a record. Also, Billy Cobham drums on this, and he's probably my favorite drummer ever. So, like, yeah, great shit. It's just everything about this is prime for me to love it. But McLaughlin somehow, on a record that also contains Santana and Cobham and a number of other performers, still manages to steal the show somehow. And that's, I think, my favorite McLaughlin solo that I've heard. So that's my pick for number 3.
It's a testament to the agony it takes to go through this list that I didn't end up putting even a Santana anything on my honorable mentions. Just that this shit is fucking hard.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you shouted that out. To continue along a bit of an sort of a unconventional pick from a conventional answer is that I couldn't not pick something from who at this very moment in time I would consider to be my favorite guitarist of all time, unsurprisingly the incredibly talented Alex Lifeson. And I feel like the go-to pick for me that many people would expect me to pick would be, of course, him off of Anesthetize by Porcupine Tree. And while that's probably that's about on the same level as what I would pick here, but it's a great solo for different reasons. And I just kind of wanted to stick to a more classic kind of era of Rush very specifically, just because as great as that solo is, it still feels like that was made in tandem with Wilson to sort of complement the moment in the song. So it felt like a bit of an extension of that. And it's not like that's where his contributions to rock music end or anything, but my pick is off of an album that I consider very underrated, that being Grace Under Pressure, the song Kid Gloves. As time has gone on, I've really learned to appreciate basically everything about this and just how immaculate it all sounds. Basically, it's a remarkable song from the outset just because his guitar tones and playing, even before the solo, are fucking terrific. Like, this is a timeless classic that I feel just does not get its due. But the curious thing about this is one of Alex's favorite solos that he's done, and he says that it actually is a solo that kind of makes him laugh. And I kind of see what he's getting at here is because this is a different, very unconventional, it's not a solo that's traditionally about power like a lot of the other ones that we've been talking about, or even necessarily speed. This is a really watery, kind of dreamy set of licks that just kind of fire off and sort of they kind of happen in rhythm with each other and then just kind of get lost in this melody in the middle of it. And it's really, really beguiling. It has just as much to do with the way this album is mixed and produced as how Alex plays it. It's like these two things work with a synergy that, doesn't always often happen. Sometimes a guitar solo can just be a great guitar solo, but to know what to do with it in the studio is another thing entirely. And I really like how kind of playful this is. It's something that I feel like Lifeson is such an otherworldly talent that he embodies the phrase, you have to learn the rules to know how to break them. And with those traditional Rush albums that I probably do like a little bit more, that's him exercising that he knows the rules. And then everything from that sort of 80s new wave phase of their career is him breaking them and doing something different and new and blending all these things together. And on Grace Under Pressure, this is an album that blends Police-style reggae in some songs on like The Body Electric. It also puts in heavy emphasis on that new wave. And I think it is as good of a version of its influences as it is anything else. It's a fantastic rock solo. It's a great sort of instrumental new wave section. Everything about it is impressive, but in a completely non-traditional way. It's not something that's going to blow you away, but you're going to get lost in it. It has a density to it that a lot of other guitar solos don't have because you focus on those solos, whereas this is very much something that creates and immerses you within the song rather than taking you out of it so that you can notice it. So that's kind of why this is my pick for Lifeson, is that it's a demonstration of the fact that you have to be so good in order to do something unconventional and sound this confident while doing it.
If I were to think about who is the greatest kind of guitar soloist of all time, not the greatest guitar player necessarily, although you could argue this too, but who's the most iconic soloist? And this is like a really difficult question, and I don't think there's a clear answer. But to me, the most obvious pick is Neil Young. And yet I don't have a Neil Young song on my list, unfortunately. I wish that I did, because to me, feels like the gold standard for great guitar solos. Yet I do. My number 2 pick is, I think, quite clearly influenced by Neil Young. I think draws on his style of playing in certain ways, but also is very much its own thing. It's also relevant because the band that performed the song that the solo is on also did a cover of Cortez the Killer, which is one of the great guitar songs of all time, one of the great guitar jams. And so the song of my number 2 pick is I've loved Built to Spill ever since I was a kid. This has always been one of those foundational guitar indie rock bands for me, and it's telling, I guess, of my taste that my number 2 and my number 1 on this list are both from indie rock bands. Yet, because I feel like sometimes the virtuosic talent of guitarists in indie rock or in smaller scale bands can get overlooked, can get kind of looked down on as kind of a lesser kind of form or whatever. But I do think that some of the most incredible and blissful and beautiful and emotional guitar solos can be found in indie rock. I do believe that. I mean, my honorable mention shout out to that Wilco song, I think, speaks to that as well. But Velvet Waltz is one of the most unique solos on this list, I think, because of the way it sounds. Like, it's got a heavy wah pedal effect that's applied to it. So it has this sense of squelching wateriness. It has a sense of like melting when you're listening to it. I was talking about it with our friend Connor on Twitter yesterday, and I said that it's a solo that kind of sounds like the guitar is drowning, and it has this real sense of just dissolving you in this sort of pool of it while you're listening. I mean, Velvet Waltz is an 8-minute song where the guitar is present the entire time and it's doing all of these kinds of things, but eventually in the second half of the song, as with that Sleater-Kinney track, it just takes over, it just dominates, and you just have these incredible progressions and sections of soloing that are just absolutely breathtaking and stunning. And I just don't feel that Built to Spill is appreciated enough for what an absolutely foundationally fantastic guitar band they are. I mean, Built to Spill at their peak were one of the greatest bands in the world because they had amazing guitar work, amazing rhythm section, really iconic vocalist in Doug Marsh. They had so much of what you would want from a great rock band, but they were so overlooked because they came after more sort of like widely reclaimed sort of indie rock jammy bands like Dinosaur Jr., and yet they never had the success of bands like Pavement. And so they sit, and Velvet Waltz to me is emblematic of this entire sort of 90s era of these really kind of murky and watery and sort of unique sounding guitar tones. And I'll build on this a little bit more with my number 1 pick as well, which is kind of in a similar world to this, but I was very close to making this my number 1, to be honest. Like, I think this is, to me, the most technically impressive maybe guitar solo on this list, just because of the way that it incorporates texture and effects in such unique ways, in addition to all of the like crazy originality and of the playing. So yeah, Doug March, Take a Bow, Velvet Waltz, always been a guitar solo very close to my heart.
I mean, if you need evidence that indie rock sort of gets taken for granted for their sort of instrumental proficiency, look no further than last year's Illusory Walls to showcase that when a bunch of indie musicians decide to make prog music, they do it as good as some of the there were moments where I was contemplating putting something from that album on here, and honestly, I'm a little heartbroken that I didn't.
Honestly, like, shout out to the guitar work all over that album, but especially like Invading the World of the Spirits, which is, what's that song called?
Yeah,
the third track on that record. The guitar playing on that song is like it's unreal. It's like so crazy and
good.
out there and so like consistently just fretboard fuckery that it's just like so good.
If I made this list again, that would probably be on it, honestly, like because I'll talk myself into it. But it wouldn't change what my number one pick is, which we didn't. It's sort of a last minute sort of ordering these in terms of which ones we think are the best or which ones we like more. But after I picked my 5 for this video, I knew what my number 1 was even before then. And it just so happens that it also kind of embodies everything that I like about guitar solos from my previous entries on here. And that's because it is both unconventional, obviously impressive, and because it is without a doubt the solo that has made me feel the most. And that is I will admit this is a bit of a cheat on my part, is because I technically consider it to be a solo that exists in 3 parts, in that it's sort of in the dead center of the song, it is reprised before the final minute of the song, and then is reprised once again at the very end. And each time the solo is sort of repeated and it's made bigger, louder, elaborated upon, and expanded. And that in and of itself, I think, is a cool thing to do, just because, again, when's the last time you heard anybody do anything like that? And here, it also combines something that I think is essential, which is how the guitar solo is produced and how it intermingles with the other instruments of the song. And that this is an album and a band that are known for their studio trickery, for polishing their sound, for making, I believe what we said about the new War on Drugs album last year is that we felt like we needed to pay a subscription service to be able to listen to it just because it was so high quality. So, and when we say that, our definition of high quality is better than instrument sound good, because on this solo you can hear the feedback from the amp in it in the first part. At the very end of it, when he just kind of really writhes that tone out of it that sounds like, it doesn't even sound like a guitar tone after the first part. Like you're just kind of like, you're just sort of hearing him and you're like, oh God, is he gonna break that? And it sounds otherworldly. The way the song is just very, like, it's a very meditative cut on the album, and then immediately get the ba-da-bum bum 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 bum, and it sounds like a fucking sledgehammer. Like somebody just fucking demolished the studio that they were recording this in as they did it, and it sounds godly. It's so loud, it's so big, it's distorted to all hell. And it just instantly, combined with those backing bright shimmery synths, just lifts you up perfectly structurally. And then it sort of goes away, the song continues, and then unexpectedly it fucking comes back again there in that final third again. And God,
I hear it in my head right now.
It's so cathartic, it's so beautiful, and each time it gets more complex, it gets more layered, but each time it doesn't manage to have diminishing returns, because this is just something that people don't do, and if they do it, they don't do it as well as they do here. The playing on here is really substantive, it is really meat and potatoes stuff. It's nothing as flashy as other stuff that's on here, but it's just kind of casting that to the wayside because it's adding to the emotionality of the song. This is the moment I fell in love with this band, and this shows you just how broad a guitar solo can even be, what it's capable of. And in my opinion, it's just a great, like, this isn't a showcase of a guitarist just wanting to show off how cool they are and how cool something can sound. This is 100% embedded to the DNA of this song, to the point where it would be so crippled by its absence that it just wouldn't be the same. And that's why I think it's my favorite, is that it's just, it needs to be a part of the greater whole. But even then, when you isolate it, it is still something that is gorgeous and beautiful and big, and it just embodies everything that I could love about a guitar solo.
My number 1 is probably, let me think about this. It's actually probably the least technically proficient solo on this list. It's the least sort of technical in a lot of ways. It's probably one of the most simple in terms of construction, in terms of what it's doing, and yet it is by a country mile. The solo or the guitar playing that most affects me, that's most stayed with me, that I probably heard the most in my life. like the John McLaughlin track, Life Divine, the guitar solo is the song. Although even more so here, because Life Divine has vocals that are sort of chanted in it as well. Whereas this is just a guitar solo for 7 minutes. It is an instrumental piece that closes out their album Painful. And you just have like these gorgeously floaty, ethereal guitar textures that I love. Like one of my favorite aspects of Yo La Tengo is the way that they utilize sort of ambient soundscapes as backdrops for their guitar explorations. So the music always feels like it has this kind of like nocturnal urban setting, like you're hearing just the hum of of electricity at the nighttime in a suburban neighborhood. And they just, a lot of that comes from the effects that Ira Kaplan uses on his guitar and the way that sound is layered and mixed in Yo La Tengo records. And what's so beautiful about the soloing on I Heard You Looking is the way that the guitar tone and the sound of it all feels like it's organically kind of growing out of that ambient sound. And it's this kind of raw sort of expression. It's mostly a kind of repeating sort of ascending motif, actually, that's repeated throughout the song. But there are moments where Kaplan will kind of stretch the motif, he'll kind of extend it. There are moments where it'll kind of curdle into just this wave of like noise, and he will just ride the noise. Like there's this great moment in the track where like he's hammering this progression over and over again, and it just kind of like boils over into like just feedback sounds, and he kind of hammers into the feedback and starts playing the feedback, and then eventually like the ambient sounds kind of around it are kind of like getting more and more intense as the feedback's getting more and more intense. And then there's like one of my favorite moments in all of music where the feedback gets so intense and he kind of just rips it off and goes back into that ascending motif again at the end of the song, and it just makes me every single emotion that you could possibly feel from music is evoked in me when I listen to this track. It is the peak of the power that I've ever heard any musician wring out of their guitar. And it's super simple, and it benefits so much from that simplicity. It demonstrates that great guitar soloing, great music that is based around a single guitarist does not necessarily have to involve great levels of technical proficiency and mind-blowing complexity. It can be as simple as a single ascendant melody of just a few notes, and it can be used and iterated and just sort of expanded on in all of these different ways. Like one of the things I love about great guitarists, and another guitarist I thought of while listening to this, is the guitarist of the indie rock band Deer Hunter, Lockett Punt. And on their song Desire Lines, which is was probably their absolute best song, there's this beautiful guitar part in that track that is very like Peter Buck influenced, I think, where it's just this dreamy set of textures that just kind of ride out half of the song, and you almost feel like you're floating in midair. And I love guitarists who are able to bring that incredibly dreamy sense out of their guitar, that you forget you're listening to a guitar, you just feel like you're swimming in sound. And Ira Kaplan's great at doing that. There's a lot of great Yo La Tengo tracks where he utilizes that feel. I mean, a lot of their albums sort of tend to end with these kind of really jammy, long, winding sort of pieces of guitar exploration. Another one I was very tempted to pick was The Story of Yo La Tengo from their album I'm Not Afraid of You and I'll Beat Your Ass. But at the end of the day, Blue Line Swinging on Electro Pura as well. There's so many. But at the end of the day, the one that I listen to the most, the one that I always come back to, is I Heard You Looking off of Painful. This is the peak of the guitar in terms of its personal connection to me and in terms of the emotion that it brings out of me. It's just, I could happily pass away listening to it.
I like that we kind of resorted to something that sort of goes against the general notion of like, you know, rock music and guitars is a bit of a thing of the past right now, just because it's not exactly at the forefront of musical culture. But that said, I feel like guitar solos are often seen as, you know, very masturbatory and very excessive and just sort of a monument to the excess and sort of almost in a way masculinity of rock music. Whereas there's something to it that's way more versatile than just that. There is an art to it that can be flexed and has various degrees of complexity, and like anything with music, it is something that can be done well or done poorly and is not inherently one thing or the other. So I like that our options are something that are a little bit more unconventional, but also something that are still take musical prowess.
Absolutely. I think it speaks a lot to what we value in music, and hopefully what we try to offer when we make stuff for this channel, in terms of like highlighting music that you may be familiar with, you might not be familiar with, but at the end of the day doesn't get talked about enough. So
Yes.
there we go. But let us know at home what your favorite guitar solos are. Again, as Jake said, link to the poll in the description. Let us know what your favorite solo is of the ones we discussed today. I should have put clips in of the solos into this video, so you should have had a chance to hear some of them. But if you want to check them out in full, I'll make a playlist as well of all of the songs on YouTube and Spotify. I should hopefully be able to do that. And I'll make sure to put that as a link in the description as well. So there, you've got plenty of listening material if you're not already familiar, but we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think. So please get in touch. Please hit those comments, and we will be right there replying to all of your suggestions and all of your thoughts. If you enjoy the video, please consider giving it a like. Really helps us out a lot. Really helps us to be able to keep doing this. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. And if you want to go above and beyond and support us, you can hit the join button. And for just $1 a month, you can support the channel, get your name featured in the title call of every video on this channel, get a priority comment response. And if you want to recommend us a record to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Fender, feel the magic of Fender.